The Sixth Sense. Chapter 1. The Incident. Jonathan Reed had always believed in the tangible, the concrete, and the rational. As a high-ranking detective in the city's homicide division, he had solved countless cases by relying on evidence and facts. His reputation for being meticulous and unyielding was well-earned, and he prided himself on never letting emotions cloud his judgment. But the call he received that chilly October evening was different. The voice on the other end, a panicked woman, reported a murder in the old Carmichael mansion, a place shrouded in rumors and legends. Most dismissed these stories as nothing more than urban myths, but the mansion's dark history was well known among the locals. Murders, disappearances, and strange occurrences had plagued the house for decades, yet no one could ever prove anything supernatural was at play. Jonathan scoffed at such ideas. He didn't believe in ghosts or the paranormal. When he arrived at the scene, the mansion loomed ominously against the darkening sky, its once grand structure now decaying and covered in ivy. He was met by the first responders, who were visibly shaken. The body, a young woman in her early 20s, lay lifeless in the grand foyer, her eyes wide open, frozen in terror. There was no sign of a struggle, no visible wounds, nothing to explain her sudden death. Jonathan noticed something else, an unsettling chill that permeated the room. He chalked it up to the old drafty house, but a nagging feeling in the back of his mind told him there was more to this. As he examined the scene, he couldn't shake the sensation of being watched, of something lurking just beyond his line of sight. The investigation began, but the more Jonathan delved into the case, the more inexplicable things became. The security footage from the mansion showed nothing, just static at the time of death. Witnesses claimed they saw shadows moving, heard whispers in the dark, but there was no concrete evidence to support these claims. As the days passed, Jonathan started experiencing strange occurrences himself, faint whispers in his ear, fleeting glimpses of figures in the corner of his eye. At first, he dismissed them as stress-induced hallucinations, but they grew more persistent, more real. One night, while reviewing the case files at his desk, Jonathan felt a cold breath on the back of his neck. He spun around, but no one was there. His phone rang suddenly, startling him. It was a private number. Hesitant, he answered. The voice on the other end was a whisper, barely audible but chilling to the bone. "You can't hide from the truth, detective. She knows. She sees." Before he could respond, the line went dead. Jonathan's heart raced. For the first time in his life, he felt a fear he couldn't rationalize away. Chapter 2. The Revelation. Determined to find answers, Jonathan decided to dig deeper into the mansion's history. He pored over old newspaper clippings, police reports, and interviews with anyone who had a connection to the Carmichael estate. The deeper he went, the darker the story became. The mansion had been built in the late 1800s by Theodore Carmichael, a wealthy industrialist with a penchant for the occult. Rumors swirled that he had dabbled in dark rituals, attempting to communicate with the dead. There were whispers of human sacrifices and pacts with malevolent spirits. The mansion had been the site of several unexplained deaths over the years, but nothing could ever be proven. Jonathan tracked down an elderly woman named Mrs. Abernathy, who had lived in the town her entire life. She remembered the Carmichaels and the tragedies that had befallen them. As they sat in her dimly lit living room, she told Jonathan about the night Theodore's wife, Eliza, had died. According to Mrs. Abernathy, Eliza had been trying to stop her husband from completing a ritual that would bind a powerful spirit to their will. She had failed, and her death had been ruled an accident. But Mrs. Abernathy insisted it was the spirit that had killed her, a vengeful entity that had since haunted the mansion. Jonathan listened with a mix of skepticism and intrigue. He didn't believe in spirits, but there was something about Mrs. Abernathy's story that resonated with him. As she spoke, he noticed her eyes glaze over as if she were reliving the events. Then, in a voice that wasn't entirely her own, she said, "The spirit knows you're here, detective. It knows what you seek." Jonathan left her house with more questions than answers. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was being drawn into something far beyond his understanding. The case was no longer just about solving a murder, it was about confronting his own beliefs, his own fears. That night, Jonathan had the first of many nightmares. He found himself in the mansion, wandering its dark halls, the walls whispering secrets he couldn't comprehend. He saw the young woman's lifeless body, her eyes staring at him, accusing him. Then a figure appeared, a shadowy form with glowing eyes that seemed to pierce through his soul. It reached out to him and he woke up in a cold sweat, the whisper from his phone call echoing in his mind. She knows. She sees. Jonathan realized that he could no longer ignore the signs. Whether it was supernatural or something more grounded, there was a force at work and it was leading him back to the mansion. Chapter 3. The Unseen. Jonathan stood outside the Carmichael mansion, the cold wind biting at his face as he steeled himself for what he was about to do. It was well past midnight, the time when the boundary between the living and the dead seemed thinnest. The mansion loomed before him, its darkened windows like empty eye sockets staring into the abyss. He hadn't told anyone where he was going. His colleagues would never understand why he felt compelled to return to the scene, why he was chasing shadows and whispers. This wasn't just about solving a case anymore. This was about confronting the unknown, the fear that had begun to consume him. With a deep breath, he pushed open the creaking front door and stepped inside. The air was thick with the scent of decay, the silence oppressive. As he moved through the foyer, his flashlight cast eerie shadows on the walls, making the once grand room appear even more sinister. He made his way to the room where the young woman's body had been found. The faint outline of where she had lain was still visible on the dusty floor, a grim reminder of her untimely death. Jonathan knelt down, trying to imagine what had happened here, how a life could be snuffed out without a trace of violence. A sudden noise broke the silence, a soft rustling like fabric brushing against the floor. Jonathan froze, every muscle in his body tensing. He slowly turned his head, scanning the room with his flashlight. The beam caught a figure standing in the doorway, a woman in a long, flowing dress, her face obscured by shadows. "Who's there?" Jonathan demanded, his voice steadier than he felt. The figure didn't move, didn't speak. Jonathan's heart pounded in his chest as he slowly approached her, his hand reaching for his gun. But as he got closer, the figure began to dissolve, the edges blurring until she vanished completely, leaving only the darkened doorway behind. Jonathan's breath caught in his throat. He knew what he had seen, but it defied everything he believed. He was a man of logic, of reason, but the woman, she wasn't of this world. He reached out to touch the spot where she had stood, and a wave of cold washed over him. In that moment he felt a presence, a sadness, a longing that wasn't his own. The young woman who had died here, was she trying to communicate with him? Was she the one who had been whispering in his ear, leading him back to this place? Before he could process what was happening, the door slammed shut behind him with a force that rattled the walls. The room plunged into darkness, his flashlight flickering before going out completely. Jonathan fumbled to turn it back on, but it refused to work. The whispers began again, louder this time, surrounding him. "She knows. She sees. She's watching." The voices overlapped, growing more frantic, more desperate. Jonathan clamped his hands over his ears, but it did nothing to drown them out. Then, through the cacophony, a single voice emerged, clear, strong, and filled with fear. "Help me." Jonathan's blood ran cold. He recognized the voice. It was the young woman's, the one who had died. But how could this be? She was dead, her body lifeless on the floor, and yet her voice echoed through his mind as if she were standing right beside him. The darkness pressed in on him, the room spinning as the voices grew louder, more insistent. Jonathan stumbled back, his mind racing. This wasn't just a haunting, this was a cry for help, a plea from beyond the grave. But what could he do? How could he help someone who was already dead? And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the noise stopped. The room was silent, the oppressive atmosphere lifting. Jonathan blinked, his eyes adjusting to the faint light filtering in through the dusty windows. The woman was gone, but her voice lingered in his mind, a haunting reminder of the mystery he was now a part of. He knew there was no turning back. Whatever was happening in this mansion, it had claimed its latest victim, and if he wasn't careful, it would claim him too. Chapter 4. The Search. Jonathan didn't sleep that night. How could he, after what he had witnessed? The woman's voice, the figure in the doorway, these were not hallucinations, not figments of an overworked mind. They were real, and they were leading him deeper into a mystery that was far from solved. The next morning he returned to the precinct, his mind still reeling. He needed answers, and the only way to get them was to investigate the woman's past. Who was she? What had brought her to the Carmichael mansion that fateful night? He started with the basics. Her name was Emily Rivers, a 23-year-old student at the local university. She had been studying psychology with a focus on the paranormal, a detail that immediately caught Jonathan's attention. It seemed Emily had been investigating the mansion herself, drawn to its dark history and the rumors of hauntings. Her friends described her as intelligent, driven, but also obsessed with the supernatural. She had spent months researching the Carmichael estate, convinced that it held the key to proving the existence of spirits. Her fascination had led her to the mansion on several occasions, and she had even conducted seances there, hoping to make contact with the other side. Jonathan dug deeper into her research, uncovering notes, recordings, and photographs that Emily had compiled. The more he read, the more he realized that Emily hadn't been alone in her quest. She had been in contact with other paranormal enthusiasts, sharing her findings and theories. One name kept appearing in her notes: Dr. Henry Lawson, a professor of occult studies who had a reputation for being eccentric if not outright mad. Emily had sought his guidance, believing that he could help her unlock the secrets of the mansion. Jonathan tracked down Dr. Lawson, finding him in his cluttered office at the university. The man was as peculiar as his reputation suggested, with wild white hair and a piercing gaze that seemed to look right through Jonathan. "You're here about Emily," Lawson said before Jonathan could even introduce himself. "I warned her not to go too far, but she didn't listen. She was too eager, too willing to believe." Jonathan sat down across from the professor, trying to gauge the man's mental state. "What do you mean by too far?" Lawson leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled under his chin. "The Carmichael mansion is a nexus, a place where the veil between the living and the dead is thin. Emily was convinced that she could contact the spirits trapped there, but she didn't understand the danger. Some spirits, they're not meant to be disturbed." "Are you saying that something in that mansion killed her?" Jonathan asked, his skepticism evident. "Not something, someone," Lawson corrected. "Theodore Carmichael's wife, Eliza. She was sacrificed in a ritual gone wrong, and her spirit has been trapped in that house ever since. She's been trying to reach out to warn others, but her presence is too strong, too overwhelming. Anyone who gets too close." Jonathan felt a chill run down his spine. "Emily believed she could help Eliza, didn't she?" Lawson nodded. "But she underestimated the power of the spirit. Eliza's rage, her sorrow, they've only grown stronger over the years. I tried to warn Emily, but she wouldn't listen. She was determined to free Eliza, to give her peace." Jonathan left Lawson's office with more questions than answers. Emily had been trying to help a trapped spirit, but in doing so, she had become its latest victim. The professor's warnings echoed in his mind as he drove back to the mansion. He had to find a way to stop this, to bring peace to both Emily and Eliza. But as he stood once again before the looming structure of the Carmichael mansion, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched, that the spirit of Eliza was waiting for him, just beyond the door. Chapter 5. The Ritual. The mansion's interior was even darker than before, as if the building itself was alive, reacting to Jonathan's determination to uncover its secrets. He made his way to the study, the room where Theodore Carmichael was rumored to have conducted his occult rituals. Dust covered every surface, and the air was thick with the musty scent of forgotten years. Jonathan set his flashlight on a table, its narrow beam cutting through the gloom as he rummaged through the old books and papers scattered across the room. These weren't ordinary texts. They were ancient, their leather-bound covers etched with strange symbols and names of forgotten gods. Each page crackled as he turned it, revealing diagrams and incantations that sent a shiver down his spine. Among the scattered documents, he found what he was looking for: a journal belonging to Theodore Carmichael. The pages were filled with meticulous notes about his experiments, his obsession with the afterlife, and his growing desperation to contact the spirit world. Near the end, the entries became increasingly erratic, the handwriting more frenzied. It was clear that Theodore had gone mad in his pursuit, driven by a dark force he couldn't control. One entry caught Jonathan's eye. "Eliza's resistance grows weaker by the day. The ritual must be completed soon or all will be lost. The binding spell will hold, but her spirit is strong. She fights against me even now, but I will succeed. I must. The power I seek is within reach, and I will not let her stand in my way." Jonathan realized with a sinking feeling that Theodore hadn't just been trying to communicate with the dead. He had been trying to bind a spirit to his will, to harness its power for his own twisted purposes. And Eliza, his wife, had been the unwilling sacrifice. As he flipped through the final pages of the journal, He found a detailed account of the ritual that Theodore had performed on the night of Eliza's death. The instructions were precise, outlining the exact steps needed to bind a spirit to the physical world. But something had gone wrong. Instead of binding Eliza's spirit, Theodore had unleashed her wrath, trapping her in the mansion, where she had remained ever since. The room seemed to grow colder as Jonathan read. The air was thick with an unseen presence, as if Eliza's spirit was aware of what he was doing. The whispers returned, faint at first, but growing louder with each passing moment. "Release me." Jonathan's breath hitched. It was her, the spirit of Eliza, pleading for freedom. But how could he help her? The ritual had gone wrong once before, and it had cost Emily her life. If he attempted it again, there was no telling what might happen. But he knew he couldn't leave things as they were. Emily had died trying to free Eliza, and now it was up to him to finish what she had started. He could feel the weight of their fates pressing down on him, the responsibility of ending the torment that had plagued the mansion for so long. Jonathan gathered the necessary materials, following the instructions in Theodore's journal with painstaking care. He drew the symbols on the floor with chalk, lit the candles, and placed them at the cardinal points of the room. The atmosphere grew thick with tension, the air buzzing with an unseen energy. As he began to recite the incantation, the temperature in the room plummeted. His breath formed misty clouds in front of him, and the shadows in the corners of the room seemed to move of their own accord. The whispers intensified, swirling around him as if the mansion itself were alive with the voices of the dead. The candles flickered wildly, their flames stretching and twisting in the air. Jonathan's voice shook as he continued the ritual, the ancient words feeling foreign on his tongue. The floor beneath him trembled, the very foundation of the house groaning as if in protest. Then a piercing scream filled the room, a sound of pure anguish and rage that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Jonathan dropped to his knees, clutching his head as the sound tore through him, threatening to shatter his sanity. But he didn't stop. He couldn't. He pressed on, shouting the final words of the incantation over the deafening noise. The room seemed to explode with light, blinding him as the power of the ritual reached its peak. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the noise stopped. The light faded, leaving Jonathan gasping for breath in the darkness. He opened his eyes slowly, half expecting to see the vengeful spirit of Eliza standing before him. But the room was empty. The candles had gone out, leaving only the faint glow of the moonlight filtering through the dusty windows. The air was still, the oppressive feeling of dread that had hung over the mansion lifted. Jonathan felt a presence beside him, but it was different now, softer, almost comforting. A gentle touch on his shoulder, and then a voice, clear and serene. "Thank you." It was Eliza. But this time her voice was free of anger, of pain. It was filled with gratitude, with relief. Jonathan knew then that the ritual had worked. He had released her from the torment that had bound her to the mansion for so many years. But as the relief washed over him, another thought struck him. What of Emily? Had her spirit been freed as well, or was she still trapped in this place, a casualty of her own pursuit of the truth? There was only one way to find out. Chapter 6. The Final Truth. Jonathan awoke in the mansion's study, disoriented and weak, as if the ritual had drained him of every last ounce of energy. The room was still, almost serene, a stark contrast to the chaos that had consumed it just hours before. He blinked at the sunlight filtering through the windows, surprised to find himself alive, with no sign of the supernatural presence that had nearly driven him mad. But the mansion was silent, too silent. The oppressive weight of the past had lifted, leaving behind a hollow stillness that made Jonathan uneasy. As he got to his feet, he noticed the chalk symbols on the floor, now smudged and faded, as if they had been there for years instead of hours. He made his way through the mansion, searching for any sign of Emily's spirit. The house felt different, almost welcoming, but the shadows still held an air of mystery. Jonathan couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing, that the story wasn't quite over. He returned to the foyer where Emily's body had been found. The outline on the floor had faded, but the memory of her lifeless eyes still haunted him. As he stood there, a soft breeze rustled through the room, carrying with it the faint scent of flowers, lilies he realized, the same ones he had seen in Emily's photos. Jonathan's heart skipped a beat as he felt a presence behind him. He turned slowly, half expecting to see Emily's ghost, but there was nothing there. Only the faintest trace of her scent lingered in the air, as if she had just passed through. "Emily?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. For a moment there was nothing, just the silence of the empty mansion. Then a soft, almost imperceptible whisper echoed through the room, so faint that Jonathan could barely make out the words. "Thank you for freeing her." Jonathan's breath caught in his throat. It was Emily's voice, but it was distant, as if coming from another world. She wasn't trapped anymore, but she hadn't moved on either. She was somewhere else waiting. But waiting for what? As he pondered this, Jonathan's gaze fell on a small object lying on the floor near the door. It was a locket, old and tarnished, the chain broken. He knelt to pick it up, recognizing it from Emily's research notes. It was Eliza Carmichael's, lost on the night she died. He opened the locket carefully, revealing a faded photograph of a young woman with a gentle smile. Her eyes, though worn by time, were unmistakably Emily's. Jonathan's mind raced as he pieced together the puzzle. Emily and Eliza were connected, bound by something more than just their tragic fates. The realization hit him like a bolt of lightning. Emily had been drawn to the mansion not by her curiosity, but by something deeper, something she hadn't even been aware of. She and Eliza shared a bond, perhaps a connection that transcended time, one that had drawn Emily to the mansion to finish what Eliza couldn't. Jonathan felt a chill run down his spine. He had freed Eliza, but Emily's spirit still lingered, bound by a connection he couldn't fully understand. But there was one thing he knew for certain. Emily wasn't lost. She was waiting, watching, perhaps guiding him to something more, something he had yet to uncover. With a heavy heart, Jonathan pocketed the locket and stepped out of the mansion, the weight of the past still heavy on his shoulders. The case was over, but the mystery remained, lingering in the shadows, waiting to be discovered. And Jonathan knew deep down that he would return, because some secrets, once uncovered, refused to stay buried.